Hello, psychology scholars! Welcome to our second lecture for Chapter 2, Psychological Research. This chapter covers research or scientific methods in psychology. In this video, we will focus on how psychologists conduct research, more specifically, the scientific method, which most of you are probably familiar with. We will discuss the steps of the scientific method and descriptive research methods, specifically case studies, observations, psychological tests, and surveys. Psychology is a science. Because we are scientists, psychologists gain accurate knowledge about behavior and mental processes only by observing and measuring various aspects of it. This approach is called empiricism. To be confident about the conclusions drawn from their observations, psychologists conduct empirical research using the scientific method. Scientific method is a systematic procedure of observing and measuring phenomena or observable things to answer questions about what happens, when it happens, what causes it, and why. There are three key aspects of the scientific method. First, the scientific method requires that psychologists follow several carefully planned, systematic steps. Second, the processes that psychologists use in the scientific method must be objective, that is, free from bias. Third, the procedures must be replicable or reproducible. This statement means that if other psychologists repeat the same procedures with similar people, they would expect the same results. Only when the scientific method is followed can we be confident that our empirical results provide a true understanding of mental activity and behavior. Researchers use the scientific method to test out predictions that come from theory, observations, experiences, or commonly held beliefs. The scientific method usually begins with a theory, which is defined as a well-developed set of ideas that propose an explanation for observed phenomena, or a set of ideas that organizes and predicts behavior. Theories are repeatedly checked against the world, but they tend to be too complex to be tested all at once. Instead, researchers create hypotheses to test specific aspects of a theory. A hypothesis is a testable, specific prediction about how the world will behave if our idea is correct, and it is often worded as an if-then statement. For example, if I study all night, I will get a passing grade on the test. The hypothesis is extremely important because it bridges the gap between the realm of ideas and the real world. As specific hypotheses are tested, theories are modified and refined to reflect and incorporate the result of these tests. Generally speaking, the scientific method is conceptualized in the following 6 steps. These steps vary by discipline, textbook, and so on. Step 1, ask a question based on observations or experiences. Step 2, form a hypothesis. Step 3, design a study to test the hypothesis. Step 4, conduct the study. Step 5, analyze data and draw conclusions. And finally, Step 6, report or present results. So Step 1, ask questions based on observations or experiences. Scientific inquiry begins with questions we ask ourselves about perplexing, confusing behaviors or experiences we observe. Typically, we look for answers to our questions by doing a Google search, which is not particularly scientific. If we are truly serious about finding the answers to our questions, we conduct a literature review of the scientific literature related to our questions. A literature review is a search, evaluation, and summary of prior scientific research for a given subject or topic. The results of a literature review reveal if and how other researchers have been testing ideas similar to ours. A literature review will lead to the next step, forming a hypothesis. Step 2. Form a hypothesis. Based on the literature review, a researcher formulates a hypothesis, or specific explanation or prediction for an observation, phenomenon, or scientific problem that can be tested through further investigation. A specific, testable, and falsifiable statement that tries to describe or explain a given behavior. Falsifiable means that the hypothesis can be shown to be incorrect or that it can be disproven. To be testable, scientific hypotheses must be specific predictions, and the variables that we are studying must be clearly defined. These clear definitions are provided by what we call operational definitions, which describe the actions or procedures that will be used to measure or control a variable. Operational definitions establish precisely what is meant by each variable in the context of a study. They specify how the phenomena in question are to be observed and measured. For example, I want to study memory. This is much too broad. I can operationally define memory as the number of words recalled from a list. This is much more precise. Another example, I want to study aggression in children. Again, much too broad. However, I can operationally define aggression as the number of times one child hits or pushes another child. Notice that for each of these examples, I can count the words or count behaviors. Step 3. Design the study. A researcher has to figure out how to put the hypothesis to a scientific test. The research method chosen to a large degree depends on the nature of the question under study. The various methods, case studies, surveys, naturalistic observations, correlations, experiments, each have advantages and disadvantages. Once researchers have chosen a research method, they must make a detailed plan for carrying out their study. They must also determine who their participants will be, how many participants they will need, and where they will get their participants. Once a detailed plan is written, the researcher must get their plan approved by the college or university's Institutional Review Board, or IRB. The IRB is a collection of individuals who review research studies to ensure that participants are not harmed in any way. These individuals make sure that all research being conducted follows ethical standards and guidelines. Step 4. Conduct the study. Once approved by the IRB, researchers can begin collecting data. Researchers use a variety of data collection techniques. Commonly used techniques include direct observations, interviews, questionnaires, psychological tests, physiological recordings, and examination of archival records. The data collection techniques depend on what is being studied. For example, questionnaires are well suited for studying attitudes and beliefs. Psychological tests for studying personality, and physiological or biological recordings for studying the biological bases of behavior. Step 5. Analyze data and draw conclusions. Once the data are collected, researchers use statistical methods of analysis to determine whether the gathered data support the hypothesis. First, they summarize the raw data using descriptive statistics. Then they use inferential statistics to determine whether differences really exist. Researchers then draw conclusions about hypotheses based on the analysis or evidence that the study produced. Researchers also determine what issues need additional investigation. Remember, no single study gives us a definitive answer about any psychological topic. A study tells us only what happened in a particular set of circumstances. As a result, researchers never say that they have proved a theory. However, we can feel more confident about scientific results when the particular study and its outcomes are repeated or replicated by the same researcher or others. Step 6. Report the results. The final step in any scientific endeavor is to report the results and embark on further inquiry. Researchers submit results to research journals and present them at conferences to share them with the scientific community. Then they continue the process by refining their theory, making further predictions, and testing hypotheses. Now that we've looked at the steps of the scientific method, let's discuss in more detail Step 3, designing the study, or determining which research method to use. One of the goals of science is description. Other goals include prediction and explanation. Descriptive research methods are pretty much what they sound like. They describe situations. They do not make accurate predictions, and they do not determine cause and effect. So here are some examples of descriptive studies: surveys, case studies, psychological tests, and naturalistic observations. Let's start with case studies. Scientists conduct clinical or case studies when they focus on one person or just a few individuals. Some scientists spend their entire careers studying just 1 to 20 individuals. Why would they do this? When they focus their attention on a very small number of people, they can gain a tremendous amount of insight into those cases. The richness of information that is collected in clinical or case studies is unmatched by any other single research method. This allows the researcher to have a very deep understanding of the individuals and the particular phenomenon being studied. Unusual or rare cases shed light on situations or problems that are unethical or impractical to study in other ways. As it turns out, the major advantage of this particular approach is also a limitation. As I mentioned earlier, this approach is often used when studying individuals who are interesting to researchers because they have a rare characteristic. Therefore, the individuals who serve as the focus of case studies are not like most other people. If scientists ultimately want to explain all behavior, focusing attention on such a special group of people can make it difficult to generalize any observations to the larger population as a whole. Generalizing refers to the ability to apply the findings of a particular research project to larger segments of society. Again, case studies provide enormous amounts of information, but since the cases are so specific, the potential to apply what's learned to the average person may be very limited. Observational studies are all about watching people, and there are two types. Naturalistic, also known as field observations, is a study where a researcher observes the subject in its natural environment. This is basically what Jane Goodall did. She observed chimpanzees in their natural environment and drew conclusions from this. If any of you are signed up for a child development class here at Pierce, you will probably be asked to conduct a naturalistic observation of the children at our Child Development Center. Jean Piaget also conducted naturalistic observations when he developed his stages of cognitive development theory. Using this descriptive method makes the observations more true to what happens in the chaotic natural world. But it also means you have less control over what happens. Another disadvantage is what we call observer bias, which are errors in observations due to an observer's expectations. Another problem is that observational studies can produce artificial behavior. For example, the presence of an observer might change the behavior being observed, especially if the participants want to make a positive impression. The participants may act differently when they believe they are being observed. The other type of observational study is laboratory observations, where a researcher observes the participant in a laboratory setting. This gives the researcher a little more control over what happens, so they don't have to fly out to some tiny island in the middle of a war zone to observe something. However, it does ruin some of the naturalness that one might get from field observations. An example of a laboratory observation in psychology would be done to understand something like children at a certain age and how they process or learn to speak and mimic sounds. Psychological tests yield information on personality traits, emotional states, skills, and abilities. Psychological testing uses a combination of techniques to arrive at some hypotheses about a person and their behavior, personality, and capabilities. Psychological testing is nearly always performed by a licensed psychologist. Clinical psychologists are expertly trained to perform and interpret psychological tests. The main disadvantage is that it is difficult to construct tests that are reliable and valid. Often, psychologists develop surveys as a way of gathering data. Surveys are lists of questions to be answered by research participants and can be delivered as paper and pencil questionnaires, administered electronically, or conducted verbally. The advantages include the following. They are easy to administer, cost-efficient, and a relatively fast way to collect information from a large group of participants. The disadvantages include the following. Survey responses may be inaccurate or untrue. If the sample is non-representative, it may be impossible to generalize from the results. All descriptive research methods are great ways to generate hypotheses or to explore questions about behavior. Descriptive research methods, however, cannot be used to show causal relationships or cause and effect. In our next video, we will discuss correlational and experimental research methods.